I'm Kara Sterling, 27, and I recently became the youngest lead surgical nurse at St. Jude's prestigious cardiac wing. I didn't wake up to the sound of my alarm clock buzzing. I woke up to a horrifying, rhythmic sound that I will never forget. Snip, tear, snip. It was the sound of cold metal shearing through thick fabric. My eyes flew open, adjusting to the pale morning light filtering through my blinds. I blinked rapidly, praying that I was still caught in a stress dream brought on by the pressure of my upcoming shift. But the figure standing at the foot of my bed was all too real. It was my older sister, Vanessa. She stood with her feet planted wide, her silhouette looming over me like a storm cloud. In her right hand, she gripped a pair of heavy-duty craft scissors. The silver blades caught the light, glinting with a menace that made my blood run cold. I pushed myself up on my elbows, my breath catching in my throat. Then I looked down at the floor. My stomach dropped so hard I felt nauseous. Lying in a heap on the hardwood were my scrubs. These weren't just any scrubs. They were my custom-fitted navy blues, freshly pressed and embroidered with head nurse Sterling in gold thread. I needed them for my final board evaluation today. The chief of surgery and the hospital administrators were coming to observe my protocol in less than 2 hours. Without strict uniform compliance, I wouldn't even be allowed past the sterilization station. Now they lay in useless, jagged ribbons at Vanessa's feet. Vanessa, my voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic in the heavy silence of the room. She looked at me and her lips curled into a twisted, satisfied smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked unhinged. "You think you're better than us," she spat, the venom in her voice making me flinch physically. "Always the golden child, always the success story." I stared at the shredded fabric, my mind racing, trying to calculate if I had a spare set. I didn't. They were all at the dry cleaners except for this one specific pair required for the ceremony of the evaluation. "You don't deserve the life you've built, Kara," she whispered, taking a step closer to the bed. "You're just a little girl playing dress up. And now you have nothing to wear to the ball." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, beating so fast I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I realized with terrifying clarity that this wasn't an accident or a prank. She had systematically destroyed my career prospects before I even had my morning coffee. She opened her hand, and the scissors fell onto the pile of ruined fabric with a final, damning clatter. I threw the duvet aside, ignoring the violent trembling in my legs as I scrambled toward my closet. My bare feet slapped against the hardwood floor. I tore the sliding doors open so hard the hinges groaned in protest. Panic clawed at my throat as I frantically swept the hangers aside. "No, no, no," I whispered, the words tumbling out in a breathless chant. I needed a backup pair. I needed my old resident scrubs, a stained lab coat, anything. But the rail was stripped bare. Every single set of scrubs was gone. My spare white coats were missing. I dropped to my knees and clawed at the shoe rack, desperate for my orthopedic nursing clogs. Empty space stared back at me. My entire professional wardrobe had been liquidated. Behind me, a sound cut through the frantic silence of my search. It was a laugh, but it didn't sound like my sister. It was cold, hollow, and utterly devoid of humanity. I spun around, clutching the doorframe for support as my vision swam. Vanessa was leaning against the wall, twirling the scissors on her finger. "If you're looking for the rest of your little costumes, don't bother," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. I stared at her, unable to comprehend the level of malice radiating from her. "I took them to the dumpster behind the industrial park about 2 hours ago," she added, checking her fingernails as if discussing the weather. The garbage truck usually comes at 7, so they're probably halfway to the landfill by now. My knees gave out. I slumped against the closet door, the air leaving my lungs in a painful whoosh. The industrial park was 20 miles away. I whipped my head toward the digital clock on my nightstand. It read 7:15 a.m. The board evaluation started at 8:00 a.m. sharp. That gave me exactly 45 minutes to cross the city during rush hour traffic. My heart stopped beating and simply seized in my chest. St. Jude's dress code policy wasn't just a suggestion. It was ironclad law, especially for a lead nurse evaluation. If I walked through those double doors in street clothes, I wouldn't just fail. I would be humiliated. I would be stripped of my title before I even picked up a scalpel. A wave of cold sweat broke across my forehead, drenching my hairline instantly. My skin went clammy and pale. I looked at Vanessa, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my sister. I saw a stranger who had meticulously calculated the destruction of my life. She knew exactly what today meant to me. She knew the schedule. She knew the traffic patterns. She had planned this down to the minute to ensure I had absolutely no way to recover. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision darkening with impending panic. I was trapped in my own home, naked of my armor, while the clock ticked down the seconds to my professional execution. I'm Kara Sterling, 27, and I recently became the youngest lead surgical nurse at St. Jude's prestigious cardiac wing, but right now I'm about to lose it all. I didn't waste a single second screaming at the monster standing in my bedroom. There was no point in begging someone who derived this much sick pleasure from my pain. I scrambled off the floor, my knees scraping against the hardwood, and lunged toward the laundry chair in the corner of the room. I grabbed the first things my hands touched. It was a faded gray university t-shirt with a coffee stain on the hem and a pair of ripped denim jeans I hadn't worn since nursing school. I pulled them on, my limbs tangling in the fabric because I was shaking so violently. I didn't even bother with socks. I shoved my bare feet into my running sneakers and tied the laces with trembling, clumsy fingers. The plastic aglets clicked against my shoes, sounding like ticking bombs in the silent room. I grabbed my car keys from the dresser, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the metal key fob until it dug painfully into my palm. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps thundering like a drum beat against the floorboards. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, burning my throat. I burst out the front door, the cool morning air hitting my flushed face like a slap. Vanessa was already outside. She was leaning against the porch railing, bathed in the soft, golden light of the morning sun. She held a mug of steaming coffee in her hand, looking so relaxed, so completely at peace with the devastation she had just caused. As I flew past her, she didn't say a word. She just lifted her free hand and gave me a little wave. It wasn't a wave of goodbye. It was a mocking, pitying flutter of fingers. It was the gesture you gave a child who was throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. I wanted to tackle her. I wanted to knock that mug out of her hand and scream until my vocal cords shredded. But I swallowed the acidic bile rising in my throat and kept running. I couldn't afford the 30 seconds it would take to curse her out. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my sedan, the leather seat cold against my legs through the holes in my jeans. My hands were vibrating so violently I couldn't find the ignition slot. I scraped the key against the plastic steering column once, twice, 3 times. The metal screeching against plastic sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "Come on," I sobbed, the sound tearing out of my chest, raw and guttural. Finally, the key slid home. I twisted it, and the engine roared to life. I didn't wait for the idle to settle. I slammed the gear shift into reverse without even checking my rearview mirror. My tires screeched against the pavement, sending up a cloud of acrid, burnt rubber smoke. Through the windshield, I saw Vanessa one last time. She took a slow sip of her coffee, a smirk playing on her lips. She was enjoying this. She was feeding off my panic. I peeled out of the driveway, the back of my car fishtailing dangerously as I hit the asphalt of the main road. I corrected the steering with a jerk of my wrists and floored the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed instantly, pushing way past the residential speed limit. I risked a glance at the digital clock on the dashboard. 7:19 a.m., 41 minutes. I needed a miracle. I hit the main artery of the city and immediately saw a wall of brake lights ahead of me. A sea of red stretching as far as the eye could see. No, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked under my fingers. Please no. I swerved into the left lane, cutting off a delivery truck that blared its horn at me. The sound was deafening, but I didn't flinch. I didn't care about safety. I didn't care about traffic laws or common decency. I was fighting for my life. The traffic light ahead turned yellow. Then, with agonizing slowness, it turned red. I slammed on the brakes, my seatbelt locking hard against my collarbone, knocking the wind out of me. It felt personal. The red light glared at me like a judging eye, mocking my desperation. I stared at the crosswalk signal, watching the seconds count down. My vision began to blur, hot tears spilling over my lashes and tracking down my cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, molten rage. I wiped them away aggressively with the back of my hand, smearing mascara across my cheekbone. I thought about the last 3 years of my life. I thought about the double shifts I pulled when no one else would. I thought about the holidays I spent holding the hands of dying patients while my family opened presents without me. I thought about the missed birthdays, the canceled dates, the chronic sleep deprivation that made my bones ache. I had sacrificed everything for this promotion. I had built my reputation brick by brick, patient by patient, surgery by surgery. I was the first one in and the last one out every single day. And now my own sister, my own flesh and blood, was trying to bury my future under a pile of shredded fabric. She wanted me to fail. She wanted me to be humiliated. The light turned green. I floored the accelerator, my head snapping back against the headrest. I wove through the traffic, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I checked my watch every 30 seconds, the numbers taunting me. 7:26 a.m. I was still 15 minutes away from the hospital and I was dressed like a teenager going to the mall. I looked down at my t-shirt. It was wrinkled and old. My stomach dropped. Even if I made it to the hospital doors at 7:59 a.m., I couldn't walk into a board evaluation like this. St. Jude's had the strictest dress code in the state. If I walked into the sterilization unit in street clothes, I wouldn't just fail. I would be laughed out of the room. The chief of surgery would see it as a sign of disrespect. He would think I didn't care. Panic clawed at my throat, tightening my airway. I was driving toward my own execution. I took a sharp right turn, the tires squealing, taking a shortcut through the industrial district to avoid the highway congestion. The road was bumpy, shaking the car, but it was moving. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down. It was a text from the nursing station. Everything ready for 8:00. The board is already in the conference room. I let out a scream of frustration, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. They were early. Of course they were early. I pressed the gas pedal harder, watching the world blur past my window. I was trapped in a nightmare, racing against time, with absolutely no armor to protect me when I arrived. I abandoned my car at a crooked angle in the staff lot. the tires mounting the curb, but I didn't even look back to check the damage. I was running before the engine fully died. My sneakers slapped against the pavement, a jarring, uncoordinated rhythm that echoed the frantic pounding of my heart against my ribs. I could feel the sweat trickling down my spine, soaking into the cotton of the stained university t-shirt I was wearing. Every step sent a shockwave of pain up my shins, but I forced my legs to move faster, my lungs burning as if I had swallowed fire. I reached the main entrance and threw my weight against the glass, nearly stumbling as the automatic sensors triggered too slowly for my desperate pace. I burst through the hospital's main glass doors, looking like I had just crawled out of a storm. The transition was instant and brutal. 1 second I was in the chaotic, noisy humidity of the city morning. The next, I was enveloped in the aggressively sterile, chilled silence of the St. Jude's lobby. The air conditioning hit my sweat-dampened skin like a splash of ice water, making me shiver violently. The lobby is usually a hum of low voices and rolling gurneys, but right now, it felt dead silent. It was professional. It was pristine. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead, lights that seemed to act like spotlights, illuminating every flaw in my appearance. I skidded to a halt near the reception desk, my chest heaving in ugly, ragged gasps. The sound of my breathing was deafening in the quiet space. I looked down at myself. In this environment of crisp white coats, navy blue scrubs, and polished dress shoes, I looked like a vagrant. The coffee stain on the hem of my gray t-shirt seemed to pulse like a neon sign. The rips in my jeans, which had felt merely uncomfortable in the car, now felt like obscene wounds exposing my skin to the judgment of the entire medical staff. I lifted my head, my eyes darting around the room, praying for invisibility. I didn't get it. My colleagues were everywhere. I saw Sarah, the triage nurse, freeze with a chart halfway to the rack. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes widening not with recognition but with pure confusion. She looked at my face, flushed and wild, and then her eyes traveled down to my sneakers. I saw the pity wash over her features, a curdling mix of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment that made my stomach turn over. "Kara," someone whispered, the name floating through the air like an accusation. I flinched. I wanted to scream that this wasn't me, that this was a mistake, that I was the lead surgical nurse of the cardiac wing. But I knew I didn't look like a leader. I looked like a liability. Then the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. I saw him. Dr. Aris, the chief of surgery, was standing near the elevator bank, holding a tablet in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He was impeccable. His white coat was pressed to razor-sharp perfection, his tie was perfectly knotted, and his posture was rigid with authority. He was a man who demanded excellence, who regarded disorder as a personal insult. He turned slowly, drawn by the commotion of my entrance. Our eyes locked across the polished floor. My heart hammered a frantic tattoo against my sternum, so hard I thought he must be able to see it vibrating through my shirt. He didn't speak. He didn't frown. He just looked. He looked at his watch, a subtle, deliberate flick of his wrist. 7:58 a.m. Then his gaze returned to me. He scanned me from top to bottom, his dark eyes lingering on the coffee stain, then dropping to the tattered denim covering my thighs. He looked at my bare ankles exposed by the running shoes. The disappointment in his gaze felt like a physical blow to my chest. It wasn't anger. Anger I could have handled. Anger meant he was engaged. This was worse. This was dismissal. It was the look a parent gives a child who has failed to learn a simple lesson. It was the look of a mentor realizing he had wasted his time. I felt my face burn, a hot flush of shame creeping up my neck and scalding my cheeks. I was the youngest lead nurse in the hospital's history. I had fought tooth and nail for his respect. I had stayed late, arrived early, and memorized every procedure until I could do them blindfolded. And in 10 seconds of silence, I watched all of that respect evaporate. He thought I was hungover, or reckless, or simply that I didn't care enough to dress the part on the most important day of my career. I took a stumbling step forward, my hands shaking as I reached out, as if I could physically grab the air and pull the situation back together. Dr. Eris, I choked out. My voice was a broken, croaking whisper, ravaged by the dry air and my own panic. He just stared at me, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. I, I tried again, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. I can explain my uniform. The words caught in my throat, strangling me. How could I explain? My sister cut up my clothes. It sounded like a lie a high schooler would tell to get out of detention. It sounded insane. It sounded unstable. I saw his eyes narrow slightly, just a fraction. He shifted his weight, turning his body slightly away from me toward the elevator buttons. "The board is waiting, Nurse Sterling," he said. His voice was calm, low, and utterly devoid of warmth. It carried across the lobby, cutting through me like a scalpel. "And frankly, I don't think they're waiting for this." He gestured vaguely at my entire existence. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. He stepped inside, turning to face me one last time as the silver doors began to close. He didn't hold the door, he didn't invite me in. He just let the barrier slide shut between us, sealing me out of my own future. I stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, the noise of the hospital slowly creeping back in around me, phones ringing, pagers beeping, the quiet murmur of judgment. I felt small. I felt dirty. I felt completely and utterly destroyed. I had made it to the building, but I had already lost the war. The silence that followed Dr. Eris's departure was worse than the noise of the city. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of my lungs, leaving me gasping in the middle of the lobby like a fish thrown onto dry land. My hands were trembling so violently that I had to clench them into fists just to stop the shaking, my fingernails digging crescents into my palms. I stared at the brushed steel of the elevator doors, my reflection warped and distorted, looking exactly like the failure he had just judged me to be. I was ready to turn around. I was ready to walk out the automatic doors, get into my beat-up car, and drive until I ran out of gas. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, hot and stinging, threatening to spill over and complete the image of the hysterical, incompetent nurse. But before I could take a single step toward the exit, a soft chime echoed through the lobby. It wasn't the elevator Dr. Eris had taken. It was the one right next to it. The doors slid open with a smooth hydraulic hiss. And there she was. Vanessa stepped out, and the air in the lobby seemed to shift. While I looked like a disaster, she looked like she had just stepped out of a catalog. She was wearing a pale yellow sundress that floated around her frame, crisp and unwrinkled. Her hair was blown out in perfect, glossy waves. She carried a structured designer handbag in the crook of her arm, her posture radiating a delicate, concerned elegance. She looked perfect. She looked sane. She looked like everything I currently wasn't. My jaw dropped. I was paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her presence. She had followed me. She had driven behind me, watching me panic, watching me break traffic laws, and she had calmly parked and walked in behind me. "Kara." She cried out, her voice pitching up into a theatrical display of worry. She rushed toward me, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the marble floor. The commotion made the elevator doors next to her, the ones Dr. Eris was in, slide back open. He hadn't ascended yet. He had held the door, his curiosity piqued by the sudden outburst. He stepped halfway out, his brow furrowed, looking from the vision of perfection that was my sister to the train wreck that was me. Vanessa. I whispered, my voice barely working. What are you doing here? She didn't answer me. Instead, she reached out and grabbed my shoulders, her fingers digging into my skin with a grip that felt like a warning, even though her face was a mask of sympathy. "Oh, thank God I caught you," she said, loud enough for Dr. Eris and the receptionists and the triage nurses and the security guard to hear. "I tried to stop you at the house, Kara. I told you not to come in today." I tried to pull away, confusion warring with anger in my gut. "Stop it. Get off me. You cut my clothes." "SHH, SHH, it's okay," she cooed, cutting me off, pulling me into a suffocating hug. She smelled of vanilla and expensive hairspray, a stark contrast to my scent of old sweat and fear. She looked over my shoulder, locking eyes directly with Dr. Eris. "I am so sorry, doctor," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "She's not herself today," she had. "Well, she had a bit of a mental breakdown this morning at home. I tried to take her car keys, but she just ran out screaming." My blood turned to ice. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" I choked out, shoving her away. "That's a lie. You destroyed my scrubs, you see," Vanessa said, turning her palms up helplessly, looking at Dr. Eris with wide, pleading eyes. "She's delusional. She's been talking about conspiracies all morning. Look at her, doctor. Does this look like the lead nurse you know? She's manic." I felt the eyes of the entire room burning into me. I looked at Dr. Eris. His expression had shifted from dismissal to something worse, clinical pity. He was looking at me not as a colleague, but as a patient. A psychiatric patient. "I brought the bag you asked for, Kara," Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a soothing, patronizing tone. "You were screaming that you needed your special outfit for the board meeting. I didn't want to bring it, but I thought maybe if I did, you'd calm down and let me take you home." She reached into her oversized designer tote. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew with a sick, sinking certainty that whatever she pulled out of that bag was going to bury me. "Here," she said, thrusting a bundle of fabric at me. Reflexively, I took it. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I unfolded the fabric. It wasn't scrubs. It wasn't a dress. It wasn't even normal clothes. It was a costume. Specifically, it was a cheap nylon clown costume from 3 Halloweens ago. It was bright yellow with red polka dots, stained with old punch, and came with a detached, ruffled neck collar. The silence in the lobby was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and total. I stood there, holding a polka-dotted clown suit in the middle of one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, while the chief of surgery watched. "I don't know why you wanted it, honey," Vanessa said, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "But please, let's just go home. You need rest." I felt the heat rising in my face, a burning sensation that started in my chest and consumed my entire body. It was humiliating on a cellular level. I looked at Dr. Eris. He looked at the clown suit in my hands, then he looked at my face. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of finality. "Take her home, ma'am," Dr. Eris said softly to Vanessa. "She clearly isn't fit to be here." He stepped back into the elevator, the doors closed, sealing my fate. I stood frozen, the nylon fabric crinkling in my grip. Vanessa leaned in close to my ear, her facade of concern dropping for just a fraction of a second. "You should have just stayed in bed, little sister," she whispered, her voice like venom. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was drowning in shame, exposed and dismantled in front of the people I respected most in the world. I wasn't just a nurse who was late. I was the crazy woman with the clown suit. And as the whispers started to ripple through the lobby, I knew this wasn't just a bad day. This was an assassination. I'm Kara Sterling, 29 years old, and until 10 minutes ago, I was the youngest shift lead candidate in the history of St. Jude's Hospital. Now I was just the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. Standing in the center of the lobby clutching a polka-dotted clown suit, while my career dissolved into the antiseptic air. The shame was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my shoulders until my knees threatened to buckle. I could feel the heat radiating off my face, a stark contrast to the icy chill of the air conditioning that seemed to be actively biting at my exposed skin. Around me, the lobby had turned into a theater of cruelty. I saw the receptionists whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting from my tear-streaked face to the ridiculous yellow nylon bunched in my fists. I saw a porter stop his cart, openly staring, a smirk playing on his lips. Vanessa stood close to me, her hand resting on my shoulder in a parody of comfort. Her fingers dug in just hard enough to hurt, a constant, pinching reminder of who was in control. "Come on, Kara," she murmured, loud enough for the onlookers to hear but pitched with that sickeningly sweet concern. "Let's get you to the car before you make a scene." I wanted to scream, I wanted to tackle her. I wanted to rip that perfect yellow sundress off her body and show everyone the monster underneath. But I couldn't. My throat was constricted by a knot of panic so tight I could barely breathe, let alone speak. Dr. Aris was gone. The board meeting was starting in minutes. I was wearing stained sweatpants and holding a clown costume. It was over. I turned to go, surrendering to the gravity of my sister's malice when the sound of heavy hydraulic mechanisms hissed through the silence. It wasn't the elevator. It was the double doors to the west wing, the main entrance to the surgical unit. They swung open with a distinctive heavy thud, hitting the rubber stoppers on the wall. The whispering in the lobby died instantly. The porter straightened up and pushed his cart moving. The receptionists suddenly found urgent paperwork to look at. Even the air seemed to grow still, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Walking out of those doors was Nurse Margaret. Margaret Vance wasn't just a head nurse, she was an institution. She had been running the surgical floor since before I was born. She was a woman carved out of granite and disinfectant, known for terrifying residents, making interns cry, and running her unit with a military precision that bordered on tyrannical. She didn't wear the colorful, friendly scrubs the rest of us wore. She wore pristine, blinding white, starch-stiffened uniforms that looked like they were from the 1950s, complete with silent, orthopedic white shoes. She stood at the threshold of the surgical unit, her hands clasped behind her back, scanning the lobby like a general surveying a battlefield. Her eyes, gray and sharp as flint, swept over the scene. They bypassed the security guard. They skipped over the gawking visitors. They landed on me and then they slid to Vanessa. My heart stopped. If Dr. Aris thought I was crazy, Margaret would think I was a disgrace to the profession. She tolerated no nonsense, no drama, and absolutely no sloppiness. I was currently the definition of all three. Vanessa, sensing a new audience to manipulate, brightened up. She didn't know Margaret. She didn't know that you don't perform for Margaret, you survive her. "Oh, hello," Vanessa called out, waving a manicured hand, dragging me slightly toward the formidable woman in white. "Are you a supervisor? Thank goodness. I'm having such a trouble with my sister here. She's having a bit of a..." An episode. Vanessa tapped her temple significantly, offering Margaret a conspiratorial, pitiful smile. I'm trying to get her home, Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with fake syrup. She came here thinking she works here, poor thing, and look, she brought this costume. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for Margaret's sharp tongue to lash out at me. I waited for her to tell security to remove the trash. But the reprimand never came. Instead, I heard the rhythmic, deliberate click of Margaret's shoes against the marble floor. Click, 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 getting closer. I opened my eyes. Margaret was standing 2 feet away from us. She wasn't looking at my face. She wasn't looking at the clown suit. She was looking at my feet. Specifically, she was staring at my left ankle. I looked down, confused. There, stuck to the hem of my gray sweatpants where they met my sock, was a jagged, triangular scrap of fabric. It was navy blue. It was the distinct, ripstop cotton blend of the hospital's standard-issue high-ranking nursing scrubs. It was a piece of the uniform Vanessa had shredded with her scissors less than an hour ago. Margaret stared at that scrap of blue fabric for a long, agonizing 5 seconds. Her mind, honed by 30 years of diagnosing problems from the smallest of symptoms, was working. She looked at the jagged edge of the scrap. It wasn't a clean tear, it was a cut. Slowly, Margaret raised her eyes. She didn't look at me. She turned her head and locked eyes with Vanessa. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 20 degrees. Margaret's gaze was like liquid nitrogen, cold, burning, and absolutely lethal. She didn't blink, she didn't smile. She just dissected Vanessa with a look so intense that I felt my sister's hand flinch on my shoulder. Vanessa faltered, her perfect smile twitching at the corners. The sheer weight of Margaret's silent judgment was cracking her facade. I mean, she's clearly unstable, look at her. Margaret didn't say a word. She didn't acknowledge Vanessa's existence as a human being worthy of conversation. She stepped forward, invading Vanessa's personal space with the authority of a tank. Vanessa instinctively took a step back, her hand dropping from my shoulder. Margaret turned to me. Her expression was unreadable, her face a mask of iron. Without a word, she reached out. Her hand, callous and strong, wrapped around my upper arm. It wasn't a gentle hold, but it wasn't aggressive either. It was a grip of steel, grounding and undeniable. Nurse Sterling, Margaret said. Her voice was low, gravelly, and carried the kind of power that made you want to stand up straighter. Ma'am, I whispered, trembling. Walk, she commanded. She didn't wait for me to agree. She turned on her heel, her grip on my arm tightening, and she pulled me. She didn't pull me toward the exit. She didn't pull me toward the psych ward. She pulled me directly toward the restricted supply zone doors located near the elevators, the ones that required a senior keycard to open. Wait, Vanessa shouted, her voice shrill, losing its composure. Where are you taking her? I told you she's sick. You can't just take her. Margaret stopped. She didn't turn her body. She just turned her head slightly, giving Vanessa one final, withering glance over her shoulder. I am the head nurse of this facility, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the lobby like a whip crack. And I know a chaotic mental break from a sabotage attempt when I see one. You're lucky I don't call the police for assault. Vanessa's jaw dropped. The color drained from her face. Margaret swiped her badge against the sensor on the supply door. It beeped green. She shoved the door open and hauled me inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the lobby, the stares of the crowd, and the stunned face of my sister. We were alone in the dimly lit corridor of the sterile supply storage. The air smelled of cardboard and latex. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at Margaret, terrified. Ma'am, shut up, Sterling, Margaret snapped, though there was no heat in it. She released my arm and turned to face me, her eyes scanning my disastrous appearance. She reached down and plucked the scrap of blue fabric from my sock, holding it up to the light. Navy blue, high thread count, senior staff issue, she muttered to herself. She looked at me. Your sister, I nodded, tears spilling over again. Yes. She cut them. Yes. And you came anyway. Yes. Margaret let out a short, sharp huff of air through her nose. It might have been a laugh or it might have been disgust. She tossed the scrap of fabric into a nearby waste bin. Dr. Aris is a brilliant surgeon, but he's a fool when it comes to women, Margaret said, smoothing down the front of her pristine uniform. He sees a crying woman and thinks hysteria. I see a nurse who walked through hell to get to her shift. She stepped closer to me, her gray eyes boring into mine. You have exactly 4 minutes before the board convenes in the conference room on the 3rd floor, she said. But Dr. Aris sent me home, I stammered. And I look like this. I gestured to my sweatpants. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a ring of keys. She unlocked a metal cabinet labeled Emergency Reserve. Dr. Aris doesn't run the nursing staff, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I do, and I don't let good nurses go down because of bad family. She pulled a fresh, crisp, navy blue scrub set from the shelf. It was still in the plastic wrapper. Change, she ordered, thrusting the package into my chest. Fast, we're going to crash a board meeting. I'm Beatrix Thorne, 29, and I was the youngest trauma nurse to ever lead a code blue team during a mass casualty event. The heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing us inside the supply room, and the silence that washed over me was so sudden it made my ears ring. The smell of cardboard, latex, and concentrated disinfectant filled my lungs, replacing the scent of my own fear. I stood there, clutching the plastic-wrapped blue scrubs Margaret had shoved into my chest, my breath hitching in ragged, wet gasps. Margaret didn't look at me immediately. She walked past the rows of gauze and saline, her orthopedic shoes silent on the linoleum now. She stopped at a metal sink in the corner, turned on the tap, and wet a paper towel. Put those down, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. I looked at the blue scrubs in my hands, the lifeline she had just thrown me. But you said, I said put them down, Beatrix, she interrupted, turning to face me. She didn't use my last name this time. She walked over and handed me the cold, wet paper towel. Wipe your face, you look like a raccoon. I scrubbed at my eyes, the cold water shocking my system, washing away the mascara streaks and the salt of my humiliation. When I lowered the towel, Margaret was watching me with a strange intensity. I saw her, Margaret said quietly. I blinked, my vision clearing. Who? Your sister, the blonde with the crocodile tears. Margaret leaned back against a stack of sterile glove boxes, crossing her arms. About 20 minutes ago, I was parking my car in the south lot. I saw her dragging a heavy black trash bag toward the external waste disposal units. My stomach dropped. A trash bag? She was struggling with it, Margaret continued, her gray eyes narrowing. She threw it into the biohazard chute. That chute requires a level 3 janitorial keycard to open. A civilian shouldn't have access to it. She stole my spare badge, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. That's where my scrubs are, in the biohazard bin. Exactly, Margaret nodded. She didn't just ruin your uniform, she disposed of it as medical waste. That is premeditated malice, Beatrix, that is a hunt. Hearing it laid out like that, validated by the most terrifying woman in the hospital, did something to the shaking in my hands. It stopped. The panic that had been drowning me began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fury. Margaret pushed off the shelf. She walked past me, ignoring the blue scrubs I had placed on a table, and moved toward the far back wall of the supply room. There was a cabinet there I had never noticed before. It wasn't the standard gray metal. It was wood, dark, varnished cedar, looking completely out of place amidst the industrial steel. I was going to give you the standard blues, Margaret said, pulling a brass key from a chain around her neck. But standard blues are for employees who follow orders. You walked through a lobby in a clown suit because you refused to abandon your post. That requires something else. She inserted the key. The lock tumbled with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The smell of cedar wafted out, rich and earthy, overpowering the scent of bleach. Margaret reached inside and pulled out a hanger. The fabric wasn't blue. It was white, but it wasn't the cheap, thin white of the student nurses. This was a heavy, high-thread count cotton, opaque and crisp. It had a structured collar and gold piping running down the seams of the tunic and the pant legs. It looked less like a uniform and more like a naval dress code. "These are the legacy uniforms," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "Commissioned for the founding nursing board in 1955. We keep a few sets in reserve for ceremonial occasions, or for emergencies that require absolute authority." She turned and held the hanger out to me. "I was saving these for a nurse who actually had a backbone," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Dr. Aris is about to walk into that boardroom and tell the directors that you are unstable. If you walk in wearing standard scrubs, you look like you're scrambling to recover. If you walk in wearing this." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I reached out, my fingers brushing the thick, starched fabric. It felt like armor. "Change," Margaret commanded, turning her back to give me privacy. "And be quick about it. The board hates waiting." I stripped off the sweatpants and the ridiculous oversized t-shirt with a speed born of desperation. The air in the room was cool against my skin, but I felt like I was burning up from the inside. I pulled on the white trousers. They were tailored, fitting high on the waist, the fabric stiff enough to hold a crease. I buttoned the tunic. It fit across my shoulders perfectly, the gold piping catching the fluorescent light. I didn't just look different, I felt different. The weight of the fabric made me stand taller. It forced my spine straight. "Turn around," Margaret said. I turned. Margaret Vance, the woman who made residents cry for sport, looked me up and down. She reached out and adjusted the collar of the tunic, her hands surprisingly gentle. She smoothed the shoulder seam, her touch grounding me, pulling the last of the erratic energy out of my body. "You look like the matron of the ward," she murmured. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a gold pin, her own head nurse insignia. She pinned it to my chest, right above my heart. "Vanessa thinks she broke you," Margaret said, stepping back and meeting my eyes. "She thinks you're a mess in the lobby. She has no idea what's about to walk through those doors upstairs." I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy cotton expand against my ribs. The image of the clown suit, the laughter in the lobby, the pity in Dr. Aris's eyes, it all incinerated. "I'm ready," I said. My voice didn't shake. Margaret smiled. It was a terrifying, shark-like smile. "Good," she said, moving to the door and swiping her badge. "Then let's go remind the board who actually runs this hospital." I'm Beatrix Thorne, 29, and I was the youngest trauma nurse to ever lead a code blue team during a mass casualty event. The heavy steel door of the supply closet unlatched with a mechanical thud that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. I took a breath that filled my lungs to capacity, the thick cotton of the legacy tunic expanding tight against my ribs. For the first time all morning, I didn't feel like I was shrinking. The fabric was heavy, starched, and opaque, pressing against my skin with the reassuring weight of a lead apron. I adjusted the gold-rimmed collar one last time, feeling the cold metal of Margaret's head nurse pin resting over my heart like a tiny shield. "Chin up," Margaret whispered from behind me. "Shoulders back. You aren't asking for permission to work here. You are claiming your territory." I pushed the door open. The hallway light was blinding compared to the dim supply room, but I didn't blink. I stepped out, my heels striking the linoleum with a sharp, authoritative rhythm that echoed down the corridor. The transformation was instantaneous. 10 minutes ago, I had been a trembling mess in stained sweatpants, hiding my face from the gaze of my colleagues. Now, clad in the stark, brilliant white of the founding nursing board, I felt like I had been poured into a new body. The scene in the hallway stopped time. 20 feet away, near the nurse's station, Dr. Eris was leaning against the counter, looking harassed and tired. And there, hovering over him like a vulture sensing weakness, was Vanessa. She was holding a clipboard. I knew that clipboard. I knew the form clipped to it. It was the standard voluntary leave of absence paperwork, the kind they forced you to sign when you were a liability, to save the hospital from legal exposure. She was pressing a pen into Dr. Eris's hand, her voice a low, soothing murmur that made my skin crawl. "It's really for her own good, doctor," I heard Vanessa say, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Beatrix is clearly having a psychotic break. If she stays on the floor, she's a danger to the patients. Just sign the authorization and I'll escort her out the back exit so she doesn't embarrass herself further." Dr. Eris sighed, the pen hovering over the signature line. "I suppose you're right. It's a tragedy, but we can't have." "Dr. Eris," I said. My voice didn't tremble, it didn't pitch up in panic. It cut through the ambient noise of the hospital floor like a scalpel through fascia. Dr. Eris looked up. His eyes went wide. Vanessa froze. Her hand was still on the clipboard, her fingers white-knuckled on the plastic edge. Slowly, painfully slowly, she turned her head. The look on her face was worth every second of the hell I had endured that morning. It wasn't just surprise. It was a cognitive short circuit. She had orchestrated my destruction perfectly. She had stolen my scrubs. She had planted the idea of my insanity. She had me cornered in a clown suit. She was expecting a sobbing, broken girl to be dragged out by security. Instead, she was looking at the matron of the ward. I stood with my feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind my back in the parade rest position Margaret had drilled into me seconds ago. The white fabric glowed under the fluorescent lights. The gold piping down the seams of my trousers and tunic caught the glare, shimmering with an authority that this hospital hadn't seen in decades. I saw Vanessa's eyes dart to the gold pin on my chest, Margaret's pin, and her jaw literally dropped. Her mouth hung open, a black O of shock that ruined her perfectly applied lipstick. "Beatrix," Dr. Eris stammered, the pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the desk. I thought you were. You thought I was incapacitated." I finished for him, walking forward. Every step I took felt like a hammer blow to Vanessa's narrative. Nurses at the station stopped typing. A passing orderly halted his cart. The corridor fell into a hushed silence, the kind usually reserved for the arrival of the chief of surgery. "I apologize for the delay, doctor," I said, stopping 3 feet from them. There was a breach in the locker room security protocols. My uniform was stolen and destroyed. Vanessa made a choking sound. "Stolen? That's ridiculous. You came in wearing pajamas because you're having a breakdown." "Quiet," Margaret said. Margaret stepped out from behind me. If I looked like a leader, Margaret looked like an executioner. She moved into the circle of light, her gray eyes locking onto Vanessa with the intensity of a weapon system acquiring a target. "Dr. Eris," Margaret said, her voice smooth and dangerous. "Do not sign that paper." Dr. Eris snatched his hand back as if the clipboard were radioactive. Margaret, what is going on? Why is Nurse Thorne wearing the... Is that the legacy uniform? It is, Margaret said, moving to stand at my right hand. Beatrix is wearing the dress whites because she is currently under my direct protection and supervision. Vanessa found her voice, though it was shrill and desperate. Protection? She's unstable. Look at her eyes. She is clearly the victim of a targeted act of professional sabotage. Margaret interrupted, her voice booming now, addressing not just the doctor but the entire floor. I personally witnessed the disposal of Nurse Thorne's assigned uniform in a biohazard chute, a chute that requires a keycard only a few people possess. Vanessa's face drained of color. She looked like a ghost. She took a half step back, clutching the clipboard to her chest as if it could shield her from the accusation. Sabotage, Dr. Eris frowned, looking from Margaret to Vanessa. But Vanessa has said a great many things this morning, I said, cutting in. I looked my sister dead in the eye. But she forgot one thing. You can steal my clothes, you can steal my keys, but you cannot steal my competence. I reached out and plucked the clipboard from Vanessa's paralyzed hands. I looked at the form, the paper that would have ended my career, and ripped it in half. The sound of the tearing paper was violently loud in the quiet hallway. I am reporting for duty, doctor, I said, tossing the torn pieces into the trash bin behind the desk. I am ready for the board evaluation, and I am ready to run my trauma bay. A surge of adrenaline flooded my system, hot and electric. It wasn't the jagged, panic-induced adrenaline of earlier. This was pure, refined power. I felt the gold pin rise and fall with my steady breathing. I saw the fear in Vanessa's eyes, real, genuine fear, and I realized something profound. She had tried to bury me. She didn't know I was a seed. Margaret placed a hand on Dr. Eris's shoulder, steering him toward the elevators. The board is waiting, doctor. Nurse Thorne will be accompanying us. And I suggest you bring that clipboard. We have an incident report to file regarding a security breach in the biohazard disposal unit. As I turned to follow them, I paused and looked back at Vanessa. She was trembling now, stripped of her smugness, exposed in the harsh light of the corridor. You missed a spot, I whispered, gesturing to her pristine scrubs. I turned on my heel, the heavy white fabric swirling around my legs, and marched toward the elevators. I had walked through hell to get to this shift, and I was just getting started. I'm Beatrix Thorne, 29, and I was the youngest trauma nurse to ever lead a Code Blue team during a mass casualty event. The air in the scrub room was colder than the hallway, filtered and sterile, smelling of heavy antiseptic and ozone. I stepped up to the stainless steel sink, the heavy legacy uniform now hidden beneath a disposable blue gown, but I could still feel the phantom weight of that gold piping against my skin. It was armor. I pressed the knee pedal and hot water blasted over my hands. Next to me, Dr. Eris was scrubbing in. I could hear his breathing, a little too fast, a little too shallow. He was rattled. The scene in the hallway, the revelation of the sabotage, the sudden appearance of the matron's uniform, it had thrown his rhythm off. He was the lead surgeon, the man with the God complex, but right now, his hands were trembling just a fraction as he reached for the scrub brush. My hands were stone. I took the brush and began the ritual. Fingertips, webbing, palms, forearms. It was a rhythm I had performed 10,000 times, but today it felt like a religious rite. The coarse bristles against my skin grounded me. The steam rising from the sink cleared the last remnants of the morning's humiliation from my mind. I looked at my reflection in the chrome dispenser. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a machine built for one purpose, saving lives. A complex mitral valve replacement, Dr. Aris muttered, almost to himself, rinsing the suds from his elbows. Patient has a history of arrhythmia. It's going to be tight, Beatrix, if we nick the arterial wall. We won't, I said. My voice was muffled by my mask, but the steel in it was unmistakable. I've prepped the bypass. I have the graft ready. Just cut, doctor. I'll handle the rest. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years. He didn't see the little sister anymore. He didn't see Vanessa's mess. He saw his partner. We backed into the operating room. The lights were blindingly bright, casting zero shadows. The hum of the bypass machine was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic whoosh thump that mimicked the heartbeat we were about to stop. The board evaluators were already there, silent figures standing in the corners with their clipboards like gargoyles waiting for a mistake. I didn't care. The moment I approached the table, the world narrowed down to a 12-inch square of sterile draping. Scalpel, Dr. Aris said. I didn't reach for it. It was already in my hand, slapped into his palm the exact millisecond the syllable left his lips. Retractor, snap in his hand. Suction. Done. We moved in a blur of motion that defied the laws of physics. Usually, surgery is a conversation, a request, a reaction, a delivery. Today, I killed the lag time. I was anticipating his needs before the synapses in his own brain had fully fired. I watched his eyes, the angle of his wrist, the tension in his shoulders. I knew he needed the clamp before he realized the bleeder was there. I knew he needed the 4-0 suture before he finished the cut. It was a dance, and I was leading. About an hour in, during the critical phase of the valve seating, I felt a shift in the room's energy. It wasn't the patient. His vitals were rock solid under my monitoring. It was something external. I flicked my eyes up to the observation gallery window that overlooked the OR. Vanessa was there. She was pressed against the glass, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She wasn't watching the surgery, she was watching me. She was watching me command the room, watching the evaluators nod in approval as I seamlessly managed a minor pressure drop without even breaking the sterile field. She was mouthing words that the soundproof glass swallowed, but I could read them. You're nothing, you're a fraud. I looked down at the open chest cavity, at the human heart beating weakly, exposed and vulnerable. A surge of protective fury roared through me. Forceps, Dr. Aris said tightly. I handed them over without looking away from the heart. When I glanced up again, the picture in the window had changed. Margaret had appeared. She wasn't looking at the surgery. She was standing behind Vanessa, her arms crossed, her expression grim. And she wasn't alone. Flanking her were two broad-shouldered men in dark uniforms, hospital security, but not the front desk rent-a-cops. This was internal affairs. I saw Vanessa's head snap back. I saw her turn, her mouth opening in a scream I couldn't hear. She pointed at the glass at me, trying to spin one last lie, one final manipulation. One of the guards stepped forward and took her by the elbow. It wasn't gentle. Vanessa recoiled, slapping his hand away. That was a mistake. The second guard moved in, and suddenly the pristine, untouchable Vanessa Thorne, the woman who had terrorized the nursing staff for 3 years, who had cut my scrubs and tried to gaslight me into a psych ward, was being physically restrained. I saw the color drain from her face even from 20 feet away. She looked back at me through the glass, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in her. She looked for pity. She looked for her little sister to save her. I locked eyes with her for one distinct second. My hands didn't shake, my pulse didn't jump. I just stared at her, cold and clinical, dissecting her fear like a tumor. Then I looked away. Suture, Dr. Aris demanded. 30 proline on a Castro driver, I said, snapping the instrument into his palm with a decisive click. I focused entirely on the patient. Every knot I tied was a silent scream of defiance. Every sponge I counted was a brick in the wall I was building against her. She was being dragged out of the gallery, kicking and thrashing, her career ending in a humiliating spectacle of her own making. And I was here. I was standing in the blood and the light, doing the work she was never good enough to do. The heart monitor beeped a steady, strong rhythm as we took the patient off bypass. The new valve held perfectly. There were no leaks, no tremors, just perfection. Close, Dr. Aris said, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 hours. He looked at me over his mask, his eyes crinkling with relief and something else, respect. That was incredible, Nurse Thorne. I've never seen a perfusion run that smoothly. Just doing my job, doctor, I said. I began the closing count, my voice ringing clear in the operating room. Sponges correct, needles correct, instruments correct. I looked up at the empty observation window. The gallery was dark now. The monster was gone. I stripped off my bloody gloves, feeling the cool air hit my sweat-dampened hands. I wasn't just a nurse. I wasn't just Beatrix the victim or Beatrix the sister. I was the steel spine of this operating room. I was the best nurse in this building, and now everyone knew it. I'm Sienna Vale, 31, and I am the only scrub nurse in this state's history to successfully manage a quadruple bypass while the hospital was actively flooding during a Category 4 hurricane. The silence after a successful surgery is heavy, like the air after a thunderstorm. I stripped off the bloody latex gloves, the snap echoing off the tiled walls of the scrub room. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from the massive withdrawal of adrenaline that had sustained me for the last 4 hours. I looked down at my fingers. They were pale, wrinkled from the sweat and the sterile talc, but they were steady. They were the hands that had just anchored a human life to this earth when everything else was trying to pull it away. Dr. Aris stood by the door. He wasn't scrubbing out yet. He was just watching me. For years, this man had looked through me like I was a pane of glass. To him, I was just equipment, a voice that handed him tools, a pair of hands that cleaned up the mess. But now his mask was down, hanging around his neck, and his expression was unreadable. He reached into the pocket of his white coat, which hung on the rack, and pulled out a folded document. It was thick, cream-colored paper. I had HR draft this while you were closing, he said, his voice rough. I signed it before the last stitch was thrown. He held it out. I took it. The paper felt heavy, substantial. I didn't need to read the fine print to know what it was. Lead nurse practitioner, trauma and surgical wing, permanent tenure. You saved that patient, Sienna, he said, finally looking me in the eye, man to woman, professional to professional. And you saved me from making a mistake I couldn't have come back from. The department is yours. I nodded, clutching the paper. Thank you, doctor. Don't thank me, he muttered, turning to the sink. Just don't ever let anyone else on my table. I walked out of the scrub room, the contract burning a hole in my hand, but the war wasn't over. Margaret was waiting for me in the corridor. The matron stood like a statue carved from granite, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just jerked her head toward the administrative wing. Administrator's office, she said. Now. We walked down the long, linoleum-lined hallway. The hospital was waking up, the morning shift change bringing a fresh wave of noise and chaos, but everywhere we walked, people stopped. They looked at the gold piping on my legacy scrubs, the uniform Margaret had given me when mine were destroyed. They looked at the blood spatter on my shoes. They looked at the determination in my stride. We entered the main administrative suite. The room was packed. 3 board members sat around the mahogany table. The head of security stood by the wall, and in the center of the room, sitting in a low chair like a petulant child, was Vanessa. She looked up when I entered. Her eyes were red, her mascara smeared, but her jaw was set in that familiar, arrogant tilt. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin the web she had been spinning since we were children. "Save it," the head of security barked. He pressed a button on the large monitor mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life. It was black and white footage from the locker room, time-stamped 4 hours ago. I watched myself on the screen. I saw the grainy image of Vanessa entering the frame. The camera angle was high, hidden, but the clarity was devastating. On screen, Vanessa didn't look like the polished professional she pretended to be. She looked feral. She was digging through my locker, her movements jerky and paranoid. She pulled out my scrubs, my standard issue blue scrubs. Then she pulled a scalpel from her pocket. The room was dead silent. On the screen, Vanessa slashed the fabric. She didn't just cut it, she shredded it. She stabbed the fabric repeatedly, her face twisted in a rictus of pure, unadulterated malice. Then she took my ID badge, my keycard, and dropped it into the biohazard bin in the corner. It was a crime. It was destruction of hospital property. But more than that, it was ugly. It was the visual definition of jealousy. The video ended. The screen went black. I looked at Vanessa. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the floor, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair so hard her knuckles were white. "Theft of controlled access keys," Margaret said, her voice ringing like a bell. "Destruction of property, attempted sabotage of a critical surgical procedure, and filing a false police report regarding the stolen keycard." Margaret placed a folder on the table. "HR has already processed the termination. Security is here to escort you off the premises immediately." Vanessa shot up from the chair. "You can't do this. I'm the victim here. She provoked me. She's been undermining me for months." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "Tell them, Sienna, tell them how you manipulated this whole thing." I looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in my life, I didn't see my big sister. I didn't see the golden child. I saw a drowning woman trying to pull me under to save herself. "I didn't do anything, Vanessa," I said softly. "I just went to work." Two security guards stepped forward. One took her left arm, the other her right. "Get off me," she shrieked, the sound tearing through the professional veneer of the office. "Do you know who I am? I am a senior nurse. I run this floor." "Not anymore," the guard said, pulling her toward the door. They dragged her out. I followed, stopping in the doorway. The hallway outside the glass-walled office was lined with staff. Nurses, orderlies, residents. They had heard the screaming. They watched as Vanessa Thorne, the woman who had terrorized the junior staff, who had stolen credit and shifted blame for a decade, was hauled away in handcuffs. She was kicking, her heels skidding on the wax floor. She was screaming obscenities, her face purple with rage. The staff watched in silence. There was no pity in their eyes, only the cold, hard recognition of justice. I met the eyes of a young intern I had helped last week. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. I turned back to the room. Margaret was smiling. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. "Go take a break, Nurse Vale," she said. "You have a department to run tomorrow." 10 minutes later, I sat alone in the break room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I held a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, letting the heat seep into my cold palms. The contract lay on the table in front of me. I traced the gold piping on my shoulder. They had tried to strip me naked. They had tried to lock me out. They had tried to break my spirit by destroying the cloth on my back. But they forgot one thing: the uniform doesn't make the nurse. The fire does. I took a sip of the bitter coffee. It tasted like champagne. My career didn't end today, it was just born. I am Sienna Vale, and I am untouchable.